So what's this giant book, you ask? This book that's full of names and names and names and names and names forever. Is this Chronicles or Chronicles? No, it's Chronicles, and it's actually very interesting. Hello everybody, my name is Austin. This is our journey through scripture, and today we are talking about the book of Chronicles. That is both 1st and 2nd Chronicles smashed into one. The reason we can do this with Chronicles and have these two books in one is because Chronicles is a retelling of the stories in Samuel and Kings. 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, they were written first. They were sort of the first round of stories about the kings of Israel. Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, was written later after the people had come back from their captivity in Persia and then in Babylon, and after they had rebuilt the Second Temple. Chronicles tells the stories of the kings of Israel just slightly differently. There are lots of places where it's very similar, but then there are places where it's different. If you're familiar with the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for instance, the 3 synoptic Gospels, they all tell essentially the same stories, but with some differences and some new bits. And Chronicles is kind of like that with the history of Israel. It's telling basically the same story, but with some bits that are different. Why are they different? Well, possibly because the people who were putting together Chronicles wanted to emphasize different parts of the story. It's possibly because the stories changed over time, because there were several hundred years between when Samuel and Kings were written and when Chronicles was written, so maybe things just changed. It's also possible that the person or people who were putting together Chronicles were using a different source. Like, clearly they knew about Kings and Samuel because some of the stories are like almost word for word, but maybe they also had a different source that we don't have now. We know that the people who put together Chronicles had some sources that we don't have because they reference those books. They talk about books that we do have, like Lamentations and Jeremiah, but they also talk about books like the Annals of the Kings of Judah, which we don't have. The central theme of Chronicles is the temple and temple worship, which makes us think that perhaps the writers and editors of Chronicles were people who worked in the temple because they think this is like the most important thing to focus on. Now that the monarchy is gone and the people have been sort of like scattered to the four winds and are starting to come back to Jerusalem and to what was once Israel and Judah, they're kind of like, well, who should be leading us? We don't have a king, but we still have the temple. So the temple kind of becomes the center of organization and society and worship. Chronicles is also about giving people a hope for the future. Unlike Samuel and Kings, which shows like all of the really terrible stuff that people were doing that caused the captivity in Babylon and in Persia, Chronicles is written now after the people have come back, and it's much more forward-looking. It's much more like, let's learn from the things that happened in the past, but we also need some positive role models to use. Because of that, Chronicles isn't super interested in showing like the nuance of people and how people can be both good and bad. In Chronicles, people are either good or they're bad. It's black or it's white, because they wanted positive role models to follow and negative role models to stay far away from. So, some of the main differences in the stories of Chronicles, one is that we never hear about David and Bathsheba, right? And David getting Uriah killed, Bathsheba's husband. Remember that back from Samuel? We don't get that in Chronicles because they want to show David as like the perfect king. Same thing is true for Solomon. He's not shown worshiping other gods or building altars for other gods like he is in the other books. In Chronicles, Solomon's one sort of fatal flaw is that he doesn't do temple worship quite right. Chronicles is generally a pretty positive book because it's supposed to be like forward-thinking and giving people hope. There's this phrase that's repeated over and over in Chronicles, and it's a song to God. It goes, "Give thanks to the Lord, for his steadfast love endures forever." And that's repeated over and over throughout the book. God is seen as really compassionate and as constantly sending messengers and sending prophets to talk to the people of Israel and Judah, to try to get them to change their ways if they're doing something bad. God gives people like every benefit of the doubt in Chronicles. So let's talk a little bit about what's actually in this book. Chapters 1 through 9 of 1st Chronicles is all genealogy, and it goes all the way from Adam all the way up to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons that create the tribes of Israel. So it gives us all the genealogy all the way from the beginning. In chapter 10, we get a brief blip of Saul's reign and the first king of Israel in one chapter, and then that's over. In chapters 11 through 29 of 1st Chronicles, we get David's reign. The story here, again, is super positive. So, for instance, when they're talking about the decision to make David king, instead of talking about all the warring that happened between tribes about who would succeed after Saul, chapter 12, verse 38 said, "All the rest of Israel were of a single mind to make David king." So, in Chronicles, everybody's just on the same page and not even going to fight about it. In fact, the only bad thing that David does in Chronicles' version of history is conduct a census of the people, which was generally thought to be bad luck. Like, counting people was, it meant that they were sort of available for things like military service, and so people weren't very excited about that. It also meant taxes could go up, but it was also seen as sort of unlucky, like you were counting a life which could be taken away at any moment. So I want to talk about the very first sentence in 1 Chronicles 21, which talks about this census, because it's really interesting the way we've translated it. So in the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1 says, "Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel." Now, this is the first mention in the Bible that we get of Satan, so, like, it jumps off the page. It's like, whoa, suddenly the devil is here, what's going on? We never get another mention of Satan in Chronicles. So, like, that should make us go, what is this word, and why are we saying that it's Satan? So here's a little bit of Hebrew for you. This is your little Hebrew nugget of the day. The word that we translate as Satan in Hebrew is Satan, and it means an adversary, like somebody who starts stuff and gets in the way and fights against you. That's an adversary, right? So Satan in Hebrew is adversary. Now, if we're talking about, like, the devil, like the sort of character of the devil that we read about in the Bible, if it's in Hebrew scripture, we see that they're called Ha-Satan, which means the Satan or the adversary. Now, every other place in the Bible where you read Ha-Satan, it's translated as Satan like the person, like capital S, right? And you see that throughout the Hebrew Bible. If we're talking about Satan the character, it's Ha-Satan. Now, every other place in the Bible where it just says Satan with no ha, no the in front of it, we just translate that as adversary. And it could be like a human adversary. It could be like anybody that comes up against you in some way. In 1 Kings, we see Satan used a couple of different times. They are all to talk about adversaries that come up against the person who's fighting for the throne. So we see Satan used in 1 Kings 5:4, in 1 Kings 11:14, in 1 Kings 11:23. Like, it's all over the place in 1 Kings. And it's all about a person who's standing up and trying to, like, grab power. So then why in 1 Chronicles 21 do we translate this not as a human adversary, but as Satan, like capital S? Why do we do that? Well, I'm going to point you to an article that talks about this, and interestingly enough, the reason we translate it as Satan with a capital S is just because we've been doing it so long, none of the translators really want to change it yet. Even though Hebrew translators recognize that this is not the character of Satan, because the character of Satan didn't exist at the time that Chronicles was written, we've been translating it like this for so long that it's hard to change. So if you want to read more about this, I will cite the article in the description box below. It's called "The Devil Made David Do It, or Did He? The Nature, Identity, and Literary Origins of the Satan in 1 Chronicles 21:1 by Ryan E. Stokes. So I'll put that down in the description in case you're curious. The reason I bring this up is because, translation is important, and I've tried to hammer that home in these videos, but it's also interesting to notice that even when we know better in terms of translation, sometimes it takes us a long time to change because people are so used to hearing a certain thing. I think it's important for us to remember that when we're reading our Bibles in English, there are things like this when it comes to tradition or translation that get in the way of maybe what the original meaning of the text might have been, and we should be aware of those things. So when you come across something in your Bible and you're like, this is the only time this happens, or this is the only time this word is used, and it stands out, dig a little deeper in it because there might be some really interesting meaning. So at the end of 1 Chronicles, David passes on the kingship to Solomon, and in the rosy world of Chronicles, where everything is just sort of upbeat, nobody says a word. There's no fighting over it. David's just like, he's king now, and everybody's cool. 2 Chronicles 1-9 is all about Solomon's reign, and basically the entire thing is about how Solomon is building the temple. Remember, again, this book is full of references to how important the temple is and what the priests are supposed to do, so these 9 chapters are like mostly about how he builds the temple and how things should be done in the temple and who's supposed to be working there. Then 2 Chronicles chapter 10 verses the first part of chapter 36 are about all those other kings of Israel that we heard about in the book of 2 Kings. Basically what you need to know about the way Chronicles tells the stories of these kings is that Chronicles is always on the side of Judah, and it tells us that Judah and Israel, the northern and southern kingdoms, are always warring, but Judah is always right. And it also has a habit of saying that the good kings are good because they do good things for the temple, and the bad kings are bad because they do bad things with the temple. So everything is about, like, temple worship. There's also a constant emphasis on, the singularity of God being the only one you should worship, but, like, it's really about temple worship and how you worship God in that space. This week's Queero comes to us from 2 Chronicles chapter 35, and it is King Necho of Egypt. Now, if you've never heard of King Necho, that's okay. This is like a very short story in Chronicles, but I think it's an interesting one, so I'm going to read you a little bit. So this is 2 Chronicles chapter 35, starting in verse 20. After all this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, King Necho of Egypt went up to fight at Carchemish at the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. But Necho sent envoys to him, saying, "What have I to do with you, king of Judah? I am not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war, and God has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God, who is with me, so that he will not destroy you." But Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but joined in the battle at the plain of Megiddo. Now, the end of this story is that Josiah, this king who's like the last good king of Judah, he gets shot and then eventually dies. And so the interesting thing about this story is that King Necho, this pharaoh, who is not of Israel and who historically has been up against Israel, is actually doing the right thing, and the people that are supposed to be in the right, the people of God, of the kingdom of Judah, all these people that are sort of in the right are doing the wrong thing. I'm singling out King Necho here because I think there is a real similarity in experiences when queer folks, when LGBTQ folks come up to talk to Christians about like things like where they see God moving and to talk about sort of the witness in their life of what's going on in their faith life. Lots of times Christians who aren't LGBT affirming will kind of say, well, what do you know about God? In the same way that Josiah was like, what does this king of Egypt know about God and what God's doing? He like totally discounts Pharaoh Necho and says like, you couldn't possibly know. You're not of God's people. I think we see the same thing when non-affirming Christians come up against LGBTQ Christians and say like, what do you know? You're not of God. You're not supposed to know any of this. God couldn't possibly be working in your life. It's even more stark because Josiah was like one of the best kings of Israel. Like he should have known, and he should have known better. He should have known better and should have been able to see God working in all the world, not just in this tiny little sphere of people that he thought God liked the most. So next time somebody comes up to you who's like not LGBT affirming and who thinks that they are the ones that kind of know everything, remind yourself of Pharaoh Necho and the fact that God is working in all of these places in the world and in people that you don't expect, right? We see that in Christianity in the Gospels all the time, where Jesus is bringing in people that we think are supposed to be outsiders. That happens all the time in the Old Testament too. So the end of 2 Chronicles happens in chapter 36, and it tells us about the people being taken away into slavery, which is where we ended in 2 Kings, right? So that's kind of like the equal point there. End of 2 Kings, end of Chronicles. However, because Chronicles was written after the people had already come back from slavery, they get to add this really hopeful note at the end of chapter 36. So this is chapter 36, verses 22 and 23. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also declared in a written edict, "Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up." So we've got a really interesting thing going on here at the end of Chronicles, and that is that the king of Persia, who has been a bad guy, been enslaving people, is finally turned and he says, I'm supposed to build a house for God, the God of the Israelites, in Jerusalem, and any Israelites or people from Judah that want to go build that should go do it. So again, we get God speaking to people outside of the like perfect sphere of Israel and Judah, right? And God using other people in the world, unexpected people, to make things happen and to make good things happen. So that's where we end 2 Chronicles, is with the people like posed on the edge, getting ready to go back. And after this is the end of the histories. After this, we start hearing about the prophets that were calling to the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, and then the prophets that were calling during the time when the people were in exile and was speaking to the people about the comfort that they will receive when they get to go back home. So this is the end of the histories, and I'm really glad that we got to go through them. Many thanks to all the people over at the Patreon page for supporting me. You are making these videos happen. You got us through the first 5 books and through the histories, and we're going to be moving on to the prophets soon, and I'm so excited. So thank you for letting me do this. If you want to find out more about the Patreon page, you can go to patreon.com/AustinLionheart. So next up, the prophets. I hope you're excited, and I can't wait to be with you through those and to look at some more of these really interesting passages and find more queeros. So thanks for being here. We'll see you soon, and until then, keep reading.